and what was left of his army of Northern Virginia was still so perfect in discipline that it answered with unabated spirit every demand made upon it. Grant, who feared Lee might get away from Petersburg and overwhelm Sheridan on the White Oak road, directed that an assault be made all along the line at 4 o'clock in the morning of the 2d. His officers responded with enthusiasm, and Lee, far from dreaming of attacking anyone after the stunning blow he had received the day before, made what hasty preparations he could to resist them. It is painful to record the hard fighting which followed. Wright, in his assault in front of Forts Fisher and Walsh, lost 1,100 men in 15 minutes of murderous conflict that made them his own, and other commands fared scarcely better, Union and Confederate troops alike displaying a gallantry distressing to contemplate when one reflects that, the war being already decided, all this heroic blood was shed in vain. The Confederates, from the Appomattox to the Weldon road, fell slowly back to their inner line of works, and Lee, watching the formidable advance before which his weakened troops gave way, sent a message to Richmond announcing his purpose of concentrating on the Danville road, and made preparations for the evacuation which was now the only resort left him. Some Confederate writers express surprise that General Grant did not attack and destroy Lee's army on April 2, but this is a view, after the fact, easy to express. The troops on the Union left had been on foot for 18 hours, had fought an important battle, marched and countermarched many miles, and were now confronted by Longstreet's fresh corps behind formidable works, while the attitude of the force under Gordon on the south side of the town was such as to require the close attention of Parke. Grant, anticipating an early retirement of Lee from his citadel, wisely resolved to avoid the waste and bloodshed of an immediate assault on the inner lines of Petersburg. He ordered Sheridan to get upon Lee's line of retreat, sent Humphreys to strengthen him, then, directing a general bombardment for 5 o'clock next morning and an assault at 6, gave himself and his soldiers a little of the rest they had so richly earned and so seriously needed. He had telegraphed during the day to President Lincoln, who was still at City Point, the news as it developed from hour to hour. Prisoners he regarded as so much net gain. He was weary of slaughter, and wanted the war ended with as little bloodshed as possible, and it was with delight that he summed up on Sunday afternoon, "The whole captures since the army started out gunning will not amount to less than 12,000 men, and probably 50 pieces of artillery." Lee bent all his energies to saving his army and leading it out of its untenable position on the James to a point from which he could effect a junction with Johnston in North Carolina. The place selected for this purpose was Burkeville, at the crossing of the South Side and Danville roads, 50 miles southwest of Richmond, whence a short distance would bring him to Danville, where the desired junction could be made. Even yet he was able to cradle himself in the illusion that it was only a campaign that had failed, and that he might continue the war indefinitely in another field. At nightfall all his preparations were completed, and dismounting at the mouth of the road leading to Amelia Court House, the first point of rendezvous, where he had directed supplies to be sent, he watched his troops file noiselessly by in the darkness. By 3 o'clock the town was abandoned. At 4:30 it was formally surrendered. Meade, reporting the news to Grant, received orders to march his army immediately up the Appomattox, and, divining Lee's intentions, Grant also sent word to Sheridan to push with all speed to the Danville road. Thus flight and pursuit began almost at the same moment. The swift-footed army of Northern Virginia was racing for its life, and Grant, inspired with more than his habitual tenacity and energy, not only pressed his enemy in the rear, but hung upon his flank, and strained every nerve to get in his front. He did not even allow himself the pleasure of entering Richmond, which surrendered to Weitzel early on the morning of the 3d. All that day Lee pushed forward toward Amelia Court House.
There was little fighting except among the cavalry. A terrible disappointment awaited Lee on his arrival at Amelia Court House on the 4th. He had ordered supplies to be forwarded there, but his half-starved troops found no food awaiting them, and nearly 24 hours were lost in collecting subsistence for men and horses. When he started again on the night of the 5th, the whole pursuing force was south and stretching out to the west of him. Burkeville was in Grant's possession. The way to Danville was barred. The supply of provisions to the south cut off. He was compelled to change his route to the west, and started for Lynchburg, which he was destined never to reach. It had been the intention to attack Lee at Amelia Court House on the morning of April 6, but learning of his turn to the west, Meade, who was immediately in pursuit, quickly faced his army about and followed. A running fight ensued for 14 miles, the enemy, with remarkable quickness and dexterity, halting and partly entrenching themselves from time to time, and the national forces driving them out of every position. The Union cavalry, meanwhile, harassing the moving left flank of the Confederates and working havoc on the trains. They also caused a grievous loss to history by burning Lee's headquarters baggage, with all its wealth of returns and reports. At Sailor's Creek, a rivulet running north into the Appomattox, Ewell's corps was brought to bay, and important fighting occurred. The days lost to Lee, there and elsewhere, amounting to 8,000 in all, with several of his generals among the prisoners. This day's work was of incalculable value to the national arms. Sheridan's unerring eye appreciated the full importance of it, his hasty report ending with the words, "If the thing is pressed, I think that Lee will surrender." Grant sent the despatch to President Lincoln, who instantly replied, "Let the thing be pressed." In fact, after nightfall of the 6th, Lee's army could only flutter like a wounded bird with one wing shattered. There was no longer any possibility of escape. But Lee found it hard to relinquish the illusion of years, and as soon as night came down, he again began his weary march westward. A slight success on the next day once more raised his hopes, but his optimism was not shared by his subordinates, and a number of his principal officers, selecting General Pendleton as their spokesman, made known to him on the 7th their belief that further resistance was useless, and advised surrender. Lee told them that they had yet too many men to think of laying down their arms, but in answer to a courteous summons from Grant sent that same day, inquired what terms he would be willing to offer. Without waiting for a reply, he again put his men in motion, and during all of the 8th the chase and pursuit continued through a part of Virginia green with spring, and until then unvisited by hostile armies. Sheridan, by unheard-of exertions, at last accomplished the important task of placing himself squarely on Lee's line of retreat. About sunset of the 8th, his advance captured Appomattox Station and 4 trains of provisions. Shortly after, a reconnaissance revealed the fact that Lee's entire army was coming up the road. Though he had nothing but cavalry, Sheridan resolved to hold the inestimable advantage he had gained, and sent a request to Grant to hurry up the required infantry support, saying that if it reached him that night, they "might perhaps finish the job in the morning." He ended with singular prescience, referring to the negotiations which had been opened. "I do not think Lee means to surrender until compelled to do so." This was strictly true. When Grant replied to Lee's question about terms, saying that the only condition he insisted upon was that the officers and men surrendered should be disqualified from taking up arms again until properly exchanged, Lee disclaimed any intention to surrender his army, but proposed to meet Grant to discuss the restoration of peace. It appears from his own report that even on the night of the 8th he had no intention of giving up the fight. He expected to find only cavalry before him next morning, and thought his remnant of infantry could break through while he himself was amusing Grant with platonic discussions in the rear. But on arriving at the rendezvous he had suggested,